Greetings, everyone. This is Caroline Staten with Transition US, and thank you for joining our online event. Our principal aim in offering these teleseminars is to provide practical support for the leaders of transition initiatives and for those who are starting an initiative and community leaders who are working on resilience-building efforts within their communities. And we want to continue to offer the webinars at no cost, but do ask that you consider making a donation. We have a donation button on the top bar of our website at transitionus.org. And thank you so much in advance to those of you who are able to do this and helping to make these possible. So the teleseminar for today is Stories of the Future and why they're essential to our survival. There are 4 major stories about the future in our news, books, and films. The one that is most rare is the one we need most. And many of us are living more than one at the same time, contributing to the sense of confusion. So Sophy is going to look at 4 stories and at the psychological reasons why they're all important and the overarching process that links them all. So Sophy Banks helped to set up the first Heart and Soul group in Transition Town Totnes in 2006 and has been supporting the inner transition dimension, the inner dimension of the transition movement from its center ever since. She co-founded Transition Training and has taught transition to people and initiatives around the world. In fact, she's been to the U.S. a number of times and has done several trainings across the country for a lot of you possibly on the call today. So Sophy is a psychotherapist, a family constellator, an engineer, an ex-footballer, and she's interested in the systemic approaches to all things. So thank you, Sophy, for joining us today, and I'll turn it over to you and just remind people again that have just come on the call that there is on our website, transitionus.org, the link to this teleseminar. There's a PDF that you can download and follow. All right, Sophy, over to you.
Thanks, Caroline. So I want to add my welcome to everyone listening in. It's a lovely summer evening over here in the UK, so it's a lot earlier wherever you are, I imagine. So the topic for this evening's talk is Stories of the Future, and this presentation, these ideas, evolved through the launch training that we created in Transition Network. Right from the very beginning of the transition process, this idea of visioning a future that we really want has been an essential part of what we do in transition, creating our own vision within initiatives, sharing our ideas, inviting our community to create a vision of a future that we really want. So it's one of the pieces that we started to teach when we developed a workshop to share our understandings of transition. And the vision piece is often one of the pieces that people find both the most insightful and surprising. So I wanted to offer some of the learnings that we have from that through this webinar, and also to add the particular insights that come from my background of working psychologically with people and groups. Because I think there are insights from psychology that really help us to understand what's going on with our stories of the future, where we're getting stuck, and connecting together the kind of overall process of what's happening. So I'm going to invite you to kind of follow through on the PDF. I put some of the diagrams in there. If you don't have access to that, the first image that I'm going to be talking to is a kind of where are we now, and it's a graph that shows, that line that's been exponentially increasing in the past years and decades and centuries of energy and resource use, of pollution and population. And the graph stops at the present moment with the question, are we at peak everything? So Richard Heinberg writes a lot about the idea that we're not just at peak oil, we're at peak money, peak cars, peak pollution, peak extraction of resources, peak who knows what else. And the big question is, where are we going? What are our stories for the future? And some of the surrounding questions for this talk is, which ones of the stories that are around are plausible? How can we work with stories in the transition process? How can we kind of get the ground back underneath our feet when there are such different versions of the future around, and actually we're moving from one to another, just as we scan a page in our newspaper or listen to the TV. We're hearing all four stories continually fed to us. So my kind of basic proposition is that there are four main stories of the future, and there are different variations of these around. The origin of this set of four started with David Holmgren's future scenarios work. And the most prevalent one, and I think it probably still is, we developed this piece of work 5 or 6 years ago in transition training, but still here in the UK anyway, there's a huge amount of stories told, media, news items, assuming that business as usual is going to carry on. So there will still be continuing economic growth in our energy and resource use, and so on. So the first line on the graph just carries on up, business as usual. And the story that goes with this is that we'll find a technical solution to every problem that we have, every limit that we face. I think it's really astonishing that there are genuinely people planning trips to Mars. When we talked about the kind of space program on the transition training a few years ago, that felt like more of a joke. But actually, there do seem to be people that are interested in that. The second story is the collapse story. So we try to keep going. We try to keep growing our economy, using up resources at this huge rate. And the wheels come off Project Civilization. So instead of, more and more of everything, we end up in, it might be resource wars or collapse of the global system. It might be that we're experiencing runaway climate change that's devastating our food supply. There are different scenarios, and I also think it's interesting that we create scenarios, that aren't related particularly to our system. So my mother was always very interested in health, and one of her big scares is that there's going to be some kind of virus that, wipes out lots of the population. So we have various stories about the collapse of our civilization. And then there are two more stories that are quite subtle, and part of what I want to talk about is how we distinguish between those. So one of them is the kind of green stability, and the basic idea of that says, we can basically keep our lifestyle going, but we're going to make a green version of it. So we're going to, we can still have large homes for the wealthy, but they'll be insulated. We'll be using renewable energy instead of fossil fuels. We'll be driving electric cars. Maybe we won't be flying, but there'll be some other high-speed form of transport, and so on. So the green stability proposes that our kind of energy and resource use levels off, that our pollution, it all levels off. Somehow we're finding some kind of steady state for our global economy. The fourth story is one that I'm sure all of us on this call are familiar with, is the transition story, or the story of energy descent. And that's the proposition that our global economy is limited by our resources, by energy in particular. So as we used our extraordinary ingenuity and creativity to go up that steep curve of resource and energy use, we use the same ingenuity and creativity to design our way down it. And that if we do that, it's possible for us to create a meaningful and satisfying way of living for all people on the planet. So I just want to say one of the hot questions that often comes up at this point is, if we've got a curve that's going down, do we mean that population is going to decrease? Is that part of the transition story? And I'd like to just kind of detach that question from this graph. So I don't think transition makes any proposition about population. It's a really hot and charged topic, and I don't particularly want to go there in this talk just about stories. And there are people that have estimated, what population could the Earth support? Maybe it's 1 or 2 billion, maybe it's more or less than that. So these graphs going forward are much more about what's our resource and our energy use and what's our pollution. And the four shapes: business as usual going up, collapse going down, stability, leveling off, and transition, a sort of gentle curve down and away from where we are at the moment. So those are the 4 basic stories. The 2 that are most prevalent in our media are the first 2 that I mentioned. So business as usual, we're going to keep going. And the second one is the story of collapse. And although there's more and more talk about green versions of things, energy saving, recycling, and so on, if we look at the films that are being made, it was really striking when we put this presentation together that there isn't a single film that's been made with a different story to these 2. So all of the stories that we see represented in films are either some kind of techno-fantasy or some kind of collapse. And in recent years, I think we've seen more of the collapse and disaster scenarios. So things like The Day After Tomorrow, Waterworld. I'm sure you can think of more examples, where we're dealing with severe climate events or some kind of apocalyptic future. And often the future is quite a dystopic version of business as usual. So maybe we've got robots and things flying around all over the place, but we haven't solved the social problems of inequality and violence and so on. And looking at these 2 stories from a psychological point, I think it's interesting to see that this is kind of the mindset of the addict. So, if we're stuck in a belief system that says there's only one way to go, even if that lifestyle is destroying my well-being and the well-being of others around me, the mindset of the addict says, I've got to keep getting my fix. And the belief that underlies that mindset is the one that says, if I don't get my fix, everything falls apart. So I'm not going to go too much into, that kind of psychological structure, but it felt really interesting to me to see how long we've been locked in this story of business as usual, and this sense that, there's this disastrous alternative that's kind of lurking in the wings that politicians weren't even willing to look at. But already we're seeing some of it playing out around the world. And that when we're locked in that kind of mindset that says the only possibility is growth, we're really trapped. These 2 stories are powerful stories that keep us driving towards economic growth, however difficult that is, in the same way that an addiction keeps you driving towards getting whatever your fix is, even though it's costing you your health or your relationships or whatever. So moving to the third story, that the kind of leveling off story, this sort of green stability story, is a huge step forward in the kind of psychology of this process that we're in. It means that we've let go of, or we're moving away from, that kind of trapped way of seeing the possibilities for the future. And we have another possibility open to us now. So we've got out of just being stuck, that if we don't get growth, the alternative is catastrophe. But the story that's being told and the versions of this kind of green future, I think, give us another kind of trap. And that's the next thing that I want to talk about, is what that kind of trap is that the green tech future creates for us. And if we go back to thinking about the four futures, there are these two versions, green versions of the future. One is the green tech stability version, and the other is transition. And the key thing that distinguishes, whether a technological solution or some proposal about how we set up our future, how we build for the future, is about what the implications are for our resource use and the pollution use. The creation of pollution. So being able to discern and distinguish between the technologies that take us towards a real energy descent future and these kind of green solutions is one of the key things that we need to be able to do in these times. And what I see in the UK for sure is that a lot of people are being sucked into designing and building for technologies that actually aren't going to take us far enough down the energy curve. So some of the examples we have over here is, instead of putting all of our waste in landfill, we're increasing recycling, but we're also building new incinerators to burn a lot of the rubbish. And local government are getting locked into 25-year contracts, for instance, with waste companies, guaranteeing that they'll get a certain amount of the carbon in the waste stream in order to make the incinerators work. But as I'm sure many of you know, in 25 years' time or 20 years' time, actually that organic material in the waste stream is going to be probably too valuable to just go into an incinerator and burn, even if the incinerators are generating energy. So we're kind of locking ourselves into these technologies that are an improvement on what we have at the moment, but they don't actually take us far enough down the energy curve to really be a long-term solution. Another example that we have here is building things like high-speed trains or investing in electric cars. And it may be that these are part of a kind of future set of solutions, but this question, how much resource use, how much energy use do these solutions actually require, I think is a really important question. And the kind of frame that I've seen people writing about is, rather than going for 10 or 20 or even 50% reductions in energy use, what are the systems that take us to a 75% reduction in energy use? That really take us a long way down that energy curve. Because what's happening now is we're investing, the precious resources as our resources diminish in these technologies that just take us part of the way. So for me, there's both really good news in these kind of partial solutions, that we're out of the trap of that first kind of mindset, business as usual or collapse, and the kind of greener solutions that we have at the moment that maybe don't take us far enough is a trap in itself. And I think it's interesting to say that the transition story, the story of energy descent, is the story that we're most missing. It's the most missing story in our newspapers, in our books and films, in our media, on the television. And I don't know what your experience has been. My experience is that when I talk about it to an audience of people who aren't involved in transition or community projects in some way, it's often dismissed as something that's unrealistic. It's a kind of idealistic fantasy. And yet, if we don't have that vision, and if we're not exploring and working out what that story might look like, what it might feel like, how we might create it, what the changes are needed to get us there, if we're not in a kind of ongoing discussion of that, it's really difficult to see how we could create any of it. So for me, it's part of the real power of the visioning process in transition is that somehow it gets us out of the trap of trying to solve the problems that are created by our present system. I often hear that Einstein quote, that you can't solve a problem with the same state of consciousness as the mindset that created it. And there's something about the visioning process where we just invite, for ourselves or for a group of people or people in our community, invite what does the future look like if we really do a good job of addressing the challenges of climate change, of resource depletion, of falling energy supplies. What does it look like if we do a great job of that and we're still living well, we still have an inclusive and thriving community, and particularly to do that at the local level, which, as you know, is part of the kind of the source code of transition, that many of the solutions actually will be found at the local level, at the level of communities, as they always were in the past. So it may be that I haven't said anything that's new to many of you so far, and we're going to move on to the next graph that's in the PDF. So if you're just joining the call or you've joined a few minutes late, there's a PDF on the transitionus.org homepage which you could download, and that's got these graphs and images that I'm referring to, so you're welcome to go and do that. So the second pieces of insight that I found really helpful is seeing that these 4 stories actually represent a kind of psychological process altogether. And the connection that I and others have made is that it's very similar to the kind of stages of change that Kubler-Ross and others have described as being a response to change that's outside our control. So in particular, either losing somebody, going through a bereavement is a lot of the work that Kubler-Ross did, and then working with people that are given a terminal diagnosis, so people that are told that they have an illness that will kill them. And I think it's interesting to think that our system of globalized, industrialized, high-consuming way of living has been given a terminal diagnosis. That's the reality that we face with limits from climate change and from other pollution and resource issues. And that collectively we're going through a kind of process of loss, of dealing with the fact that life is not going to be the same without this thing that we've been depending on, this thing that's provided for many of us and our ancestors, and many of us believed would also be providing for our children. And the stages of change, this is a kind of rough approximation, but the stages of change that Kubler-Ross and others describe, the first one is the state of kind of shock and denial, which says it can't possibly be happening, this can't be true, I won't accept the evidence that I've got this illness. And pretending that everything is normal. So that first business as usual story that's still hanging around can be seen as that kind of state of denial or shock. And often the second phase that people go to is a kind of anger and a rage. And I think the collapse story is one version of that anger that says, if I can't go on as things were, everything is meaningless. I'm furious with the system, and there's no life without that. I can't see any way of making a meaningful life without things being the way that they have been. So collapse is kind of a mix of the anger and the despair stage of responding to loss. And then this green stability, the kind of leveling off that says, maybe we can keep most of our affluent lifestyles, those of us that are doing well in the richer countries. One way of understanding that is that it's a kind of bargaining process, that we're working through coming to terms with the reality of a future with much less affluence, much less material goods. And I don't know about you, but I often find myself and I hear others going through this process that goes, I'll give up something, but I'll keep something else. Again, I hear friends and family saying, well, I'm going to stop eating meat, but I'm going to keep the car. Or I'm going to cut down on how much I travel, but I'm going to, carry on buying shoes or whatever it is. So there's a way that green stability that is a kind of bargaining process. Maybe I can keep some of it. And there's also a process of figuring out, what will we be able to keep? What is going to be there in the future that we have these days? And in this kind of overarching process of responding to change, the energy descent story, the kind of coming down the energy curve, is really reaching the place of acceptance. So that proposes, that we get to a place where we accept the same limits that every other species is subject to on the planet, that we can't outlive our ecological means and our ecological resources. And the best thing that we can do is we can design for that and plan for it and put in place the best systems that we can. So there's a way that coming to that place, for me, brings a real peace and that sense that now we can get on with the real work, instead of, dealing with all of these other stories that are slightly in denial of reality and how things are. Now we've got our feet on the ground and we can start planning for a future that's really possible. So I think it's helpful to see, that there's a way that these 4 stories is a huge collective process of us working through a kind of response to change. And that there's no way that we could do it without all of these 4 stories being present. So when I remember, this process and remind myself, that I also went through these stages, and in some ways I'm still going through them, it helps me to be less judgmental about the bits of the system that are stuck in one of these stages or that are still caught in the belief system of one of these other stages. I just want to say a little bit more about models of loss, because there are other people that have been working with different models of loss. For example, in the UK, there's a project called Carbon Conversations that takes models of loss from people like Warden and applies them to engaging people around conversations about climate change. So Carbon Conversations was specifically designed to support people through a process of coming to terms with climate change. And they used Warden's model of loss, and that includes he has kind of tasks of mourning, so the tasks that we go through in order to come to terms with a bereavement or a loss of some kind. And there are a number of tasks, and they include, the first one I'm going to suggest is, there's something about just getting to grips with the information, that we digest the information and make meaning out of it for ourselves. So what does that mean for me? What does that mean for my life, for my children's future? What does that mean for the work that I do? What does it mean for my relationships with people? How am I going to live a meaningful and satisfying life now that my whole view of the world is different? One of the other tasks is to make a space for the feelings of grief and fear and anger and betrayal, uncertainty, confusion, all of those feelings that come up when we're dealing with a really significant change. So Rob sometimes talks about that peak oil moment that he had when he saw the End of Suburbia film. And it's something that's, often spoken about, that there's a moment for some people, or a gradual process of realizing how different the future's going to be to what we grew up expecting, and that there are lots of feelings that come up with that. So making those feelings normal and giving a space for people to share them with others or work through them on their own is a really important part of kind of supporting a healthy process of getting to grips with this change. Another of the tasks is letting go of the old sense of identity and forming a new one. So I don't know, how much you've reflected on your own process of coming to terms with transition, and for many people it's something that they've been with over many, many years. But I know that for me, part of the process has meant that I've lost friends, people who I used to be close with. I found it really hard to stay close with them because they're in a completely different way of seeing what the future's going to be like to where I am. And I feel very blessed, that I have many friends. My partner is somebody who totally gets transition and works for transition as well. But I've met many people where they feel like they're the only ones. They're the only person in their family, in their workplace, that's seeing, this enormous change that's happening. And they feel really isolated. So for them there's a process, and for me there was a process of renegotiating friendships, letting go of some of those friendships, keeping asking that question, who am I now? Who am I in the light of this new way of seeing the world and the future? And there's something about, it's one of the things that I think inner transition is helpful in helping us to see something about making places in our transition projects for people to go through this process. So it's one of the things that I think we can be unhelpful with, those of us that get change really quickly, or, see, okay, if the future's going to be like that, then I need to do this, this and this, and now we're doing it. And I know people that have gone through that change process incredibly fast, and within 6 months, they've moved and they're running a farming business where they used to be in the city being a stockbroker. People really change radically, but for many people that process takes a lot of time. So we help people the most to get through that if we don't just give information, but also give places for people to have conversations, places for people to support each other, places for people just to be with others that are going through the same process and get support and share some of the feelings. So I think it's interesting, we've offered things like Work That Reconnects, workshops in Totnes, and many other places have, for the public as well as for people that are leaders in transition. And some of those, in some places, those projects and those workshops and those support spaces have really taken and become a key part of supporting people through that process. And I'm seeing that there's a renewed interest in Totnes. So somebody here recently set up an Active Hope group working with Joanna Macy and Chris Johnston's book. And their group of 15 sold out, and they had 40 or 50 people all wanting to do that. So I'm interested that at this time when it feels like the reality of the change is breaking through in more and more places, here in the UK anyway, it feels like more and more people are looking for that kind of small group support. So that's a little bit about the overall psychological process. And I just want to say a last word about the kind of working with stories in this way and what I think it can give people. So we use this 4-story, this sort of 4 scenarios piece and presentation in some work we did with local government here in the UK several years ago. We invited people to reflect on these 4 stories of the future and to ask within their organisation, in what way are you acting as if this story is true? In what way are you working on projects, planning things for the future, as if business as usual or collapse or a kind of green stability or an energy descent future is the reality? And we also asked them, in what way are you being required to think as if that's true? So, either by your electorate or, by local people or by the national government, by, what are your performance indicators? What are you required to deliver? And what we found is that people were actually living and working with all of these 4 stories at once without there having been any conversation about the assumptions that underlie the 4 stories. So there's something about living in this time where all of these 4 stories are on, most of the pages of our news. So we see a story about climate change next to an advert for, long-haul foreign holidays. We see something about, insulate your home next to, more and more advertising to consume more and more products. And there's something about living with all of these stories at the same time that I think gives us a kind of state of psychological stress and actually contributes to people just disconnecting from the whole question. So what we found when we were working with people in local government is that just naming the 4 stories and exploring what they meant kind of gave people their ground back. It kind of enabled them to get clear, at least for themselves, when I'm looking at building flood defenses for vulnerable coastal villages, I'm talking about some kind of a collapse scenario, with rising sea levels and significant climate change. When I'm looking at cutting down services to collect waste from, remote villages, I'm in some kind of a energy descent or a, green stability kind of future where I know that I need to cut fuel use. And when I'm being required to build new business parks because we're planning for economic growth in our local community, I'm in a business as usual scenario. So I personally, and I saw it with these people, and I've seen it with a lot of people when I talk about these 4 stories, there's something about getting clear about them that just helps us to get an inner clarity through that kind of confusion. And what really helps is to be clear about what distinguishes the 4 stories, and basically, between the first 3, the thing that distinguishes them is our assumptions about energy and resource use. And as I said earlier, the 2 that I think are most difficult to prize apart, and you may not agree with me about some of the things that I've said, are the energy descent scenario and the green stability, which are the technologies that are really going to serve us in the long run. So, I don't think we can actually know that yet. I think that's something that we're going to have to keep exploring and trying out and refining as the years go by. So that's kind of most of what I wanted to say about stories. We actually created a game. I don't think we've ever finalized a version of it, but you could make a game for people looking at different technologies that invites them to say which story they belong to, and that's a way of just getting groups to explore what those stories mean and practice thinking about the assumptions that are underneath, technologies or ideas. So I hope this has been useful and brought some insight. So seeing how we can apply the kind of psychological models to these 4 stories, both the story of addictions, that state of addictions where we get trapped in a story and our addiction to growth or to consumption. That's, behind that addiction and that compulsion around we have to have growth, is the fear that the only alternative is some kind of apocalyptic collapse. And then emerging out of that, the next story that sort of comes into view is the kind of bargaining process that, we'll cut things down, we'll recycle more, we'll reduce our consumption by 10 or 20%. And the story that still is, I think in many arenas is still really in the background, is still waiting to emerge, is the energy descent story. It's the story that we need the most, and that's the most useful for us in terms of visioning a future that really can work and that helps us to build technologies and infrastructure for the long term, and start to get to grips with the process that we're really in. And it's the story that is the most missing. So I guess I want to just really speak up for that visioning part of the transition process, and acknowledge how important it's been for me and for many of the people that I've seen engage with transition. So that's kind of the end of the talk. I put some questions at the end of the PDF, and if you've joined late, the PDF is downloadable on the transitionus.org homepage. So, I left some questions about how would you distinguish, what stories, things like building a new airport runway or subsidizing renewable energy technologies, where do they belong? And I suggested an inquiry that I think is helpful to do yourself or to do in a transition group, is to see that in some ways most of us are living all of those 4 stories. So there's some way that our lives express, a growth paradigm as well as energy descent, as well as some sort of bargaining process, And, I know that I often get to that place where I feel like we're just not going to make it. The future actually is going to be bleak and involve a lot of collapse. And I hear from countries like Spain and Portugal, where their economy has gone into meltdown, and it feels like they're already living that bit of the future. So you might want to just take a few minutes to reflect on that. Is there a way that you're living, more than one story in your life at the moment? I'm going to take a drink of water. I invite you just to have a moment of digestion and pause. And then we're going to hand it over to Caroline to invite questions or comments, and it would be great to hear from you. I know some of you are people that are working a lot with stories, so I'd love to hear anything about how others are working or any questions on anything that I've said. Thank you.
Again, just a pause to reflect. And when you are ready, you can press 1 on your keypad and start the stack with any questions you have for Sophy, comments, any stories to share.
And Caroline, if I can make a suggestion, maybe we could just hear a few questions rather than trying to answer them one at a time. So maybe we can just hear a few kind of comments or questions, and then I can make notes and kind of try to respond to more than one.
Well, we'll take these first 3 then. John Duvall, go ahead.
Hi, Caroline and Megan. Is it Megan?
Sophie.
Sophie,
I'm sorry. I got in a tad late. Anyway, I just wanted to mention a couple of things that I'm doing. In terms of defining who my community is, I teach at a university, and so I have my university committee, and then I live in a neighborhood where I have neighbors. And I'm seeking ways to communicate and network within those particular communities. And in my university, I can give a lecture or a presentation or design a workshop where I'll invite people in that community to come in and hear what I have to say about transition, but also give them the opportunity to have their own input in a workshop sort of format. And then in my neighborhood, the neighborhood I live in may be rather unique, and since I live in Rohnert Park, which is a very, very designed neighborhood, but we have a website for interacting with our neighbors. So within about maybe a 1 mile radius or half-mile radius, something like that. And so I can actually get on that website and, output suggestions to people that live close to me, and perhaps, even organize, backyard barbecues or something like that to invite people to get together and talk about stuff. So, for me, it's tremendously empowering to actually be doing something rather than just be sitting in my room stewing about how bad things are. And so that's what I have to offer. That's sort of look at who your community is and what you can functionally do within that community to really make things happen.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, John. I'll go on to Julie Gabrielli. Go ahead, Julie. I think you muted yourself. Let's see. There we go. Well, you were there for a minute. Julie, we're not hearing you. We'll come back to you. How's this? Livy, go ahead.
Hi. So the first comment that I wanted to make was I came in a little bit late, so I don't know if she mentioned it, but one of the things that's happening in terms of getting out a story that is about energy descent and transition is that Starhawk is making a movie out of her book, The Fifth Sacred Thing, which could well very be the first major feature film that really tells a bold new story about what the future could or has to look like if we consider energy descent and the unraveling of the industrial complex. So if people want to see what's going on with that, it's thefifthsacredthing.com. It's pretty inspiring as a book if you want to read the book too. And then the other thing, I had a question. So first, my background, I am trained as a counselor. I did a lot of work from my practicum and professional work with grief and grieving folks. And I'm wondering if you're familiar with the work of Carolyn Baker and the idea of our industrial culture needing hospice. And because you use the Kubler-Ross analogy, which I love, I totally love and totally am excited to jump into and take further. But I'm wondering if you could speak to the idea of even taking it further to a hospice, and that,
Shall we take one more, Sophie?
Yeah.
Julie, let's try you again.
Okay.
You just keep beeping in for a moment, and then we don't hear you. So I'll go on to Jim Hall.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. I had a question about kind of the inner work that goes along with all of this, and I love what you're saying about Kubler-Ross and about the stages and working with people who are kind of reacting and trying to adjust themselves inwardly to the outer change that's going on and the big story of energy descent. And I value that, but I also wonder about the need for a kind of personal descent, a kind of psychological descent, a spirituality of descent, descent into soul, as a kind of inner transformation that may be even has to happen to a certain extent within people prior to being able to really actualize the outer energy descent things that we get to. And I guess maybe in the past there have been some issues around spirituality and transition, so I don't want to try to get into all that. But I just wonder if beyond the very necessary kind of coping mechanisms and working with people at the heart and soul level of how we adapt our inner life to the outer changes we need, if there isn't, if you see any need for a deeper inner work of transformation, that might even be a sort of parallel inner descent that might be seen as crucial to the outer descent that we also need.
Great, thank you.
Sophie, did you want to hear more questions or respond?
Let's take a couple more, yeah.
Okay.
Because some of these are comments anyway, so yeah, it's great to hear people. Thank you.
Okay, let's take a few more then. Sharon Willen.
Hi. I'm an artist and a writer. I was previously a teacher, and I know that in teaching you always want to start where the students are and bring them along. And what I've never been able to get my hands around is a transition story about transition. What is the bridge that a picture or a verbal picture that we want to paint for people of the bridge to a better future? It's that middle ground to keep people that I can't compose, to keep people from thinking we're all pie in the sky or out in left field someplace. I want to get them to this vision of a better future, but there has to be like baby steps. And personally, I guess, other than doing things that I consider too small, like the community, the very narrow community activism, community garden and recycling and such, I don't know how to paint that middle ground picture. Honestly, I do think that the energy assessment plan or proposal that was just issued by the Obama administration, not to be political at all, but I think that the visualizations that were included in there were outstanding because they were interactive visuals that gave people a chance to, with a swipe of the hand, look at the difference in their state where they live between what the temperature change or the precipitation change is going to be if we do nothing, or if we adopt these proposals, how your life, how will it impact where you live. That is the kind of thing I'd like to be able to do, but I really need some help in creating for myself the middle ground between here and living in Totnes, where to me it's like nirvana. You're already well far ahead of us. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. We've got Jed Diamond. Go ahead.
Yes, I just wanted to appreciate the whole presentation. I live in a little town called Willits, California, and we've been doing transition work for quite some years. And I just wanted to comment that I really like the notion of looking at some of this through the lens of addiction, because I think we really are addicted in ways, and we have some technologies and some ways of dealing with addictions, obviously on a personal level, that I think can be applied, as I think you are, to the larger issues of community. And I also really appreciate your sharing in a sense, the fact that we're all, or many of us, living at different times or different degrees, these 4 different stories. I know I do, and I feel guilty. I talk and I teach transition kind of concepts, but there are times I just go, I don't think we're going to make it. I think collapse is here. Or there are times I think, God, I want to get in my car and just drive, and I don't care, business as usual. I need to get to work kind of thing. So I think it's very freeing that you acknowledge that and you give a validation to talk about what's true in our lives, not just the ideal of how we think we should be living our lives.
Thank you.
And let's do one more. Is that okay, Sophie?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, Mark Birch.
Yes, hello. Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yes. I'm calling from Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is in Canada. And just a couple of things. The middle ground question is a really important one. I also was trained as a psychotherapist, and over the last 20 years have been a writer and a teacher about voluntary simplicity. And more recently in this community, the chairman of our local transition group. And I sometimes wonder, I think it's sort of received wisdom that if people are going to make a transition from one way of life to another, that it will happen in baby steps, that this is all we're capable of, or this is the normal way that that change occurs incrementally. And I think for many people that may be true. But I think there are also people who are actually ready to take a very great step. These are the people who are already signing up to go to Mars, as deluded as that idea may seem. There are people who are ready to live on the ocean floor. They're ready to live on an alien planet. They're ready for a change proportionate to the kind of challenge we face. So, and I'm suggesting that maybe there are different audiences, or everybody is coming at this particular historical cusp from different perspectives with different capacities, which means that we might have to create different messages for those people, and also different pathways for them to engage this process. I think Sophie already alluded to that, or one of the other callers, that there were some people who were already on board and within months made very significant changes to their lifestyle, whereas others need a more incremental and slower approach. So I think probably we need to to be preparing messages for these different listeners that are tailored to their aptitudes and their motivation and their grasp of the issues. I just wanted to mention one other thing quickly, which has been a wonderful resource to me. It's a book by Jonathan Lear, and Lear is just like King Lear. It's called Radical Hope. Jonathan Lear is a philosopher, and the book is written in beautifully reasoned and beautifully presented. But what it is a story about is the transition that Crow Indians in North America made in response to the incursion of white settlers at the end of the 19th century and early part of the 20th century, where these people, the Crow people, faced a kind of mortal transition of their culture. Their old way of life was passing away because all of the circumstances that had framed it in the past were changing. And the story is how these people coped with this. And one of the principal ways of doing so was through visioning, through dreams and dream interpretation that helped the Crow develop a new sense of their cultural identity. And of many First Nations or Aboriginal groups in North America, the Crow have one of the few intact land bases and one of the few intact cultural identities among Aboriginal people left in North America. So it's a very, very interesting read and very well written, and I think very apposite to the situation we're in. Thank you for giving me so much time.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. So, Sophie, over to you to respond to those, and then we can see how much time we have and hear from others.
Great. Thank you. It's really good to hear from several of you. And part of what I hear when I hear several voices is what you're saying, Mark, and others, which is about the diversity of the journey that people go on, and there is no one recipe, there is no one process that works for everybody. So this question, isn't it, is how do we make our own engagements with people, whether it's in a transition project or just in the conversations that we have with others in our lives, how do we make that as sensitive and responsive and accessible and varied as possible, I think is one of the challenges for transition, while we're kind to ourselves and accept that we can't do everything and we won't meet everybody, and we have our own limits on resources and so on. So I'm really hearing that in what you're saying. Some people do it quickly. Some people it takes a long time. Some people are ready for the big jump and they want it. They want to be challenged and be told the truth. And I think there's something about the power of speaking the truth, which is a part of what I felt when I talk about these 4 stories. There's something about naming the truth that gives people their ground back and is energizing and empowering in and of itself. Some of the other themes that you've raised, is there a kind of an inner descent as well? Is there a spiritual journey? And I think for many of us there is. So one of the, Rob called it his peak oil moment. Some people call it the dark night of the soul. For many people there is a place where we allow ourselves to get in touch with the falling away of the structures that have held us. And looking at it from a spiritual or psychological perspective, I might say, one way of seeing that is we're looking at the falling away of this sort of false belief, this false structure that we've made for ourselves that material affluence is the thing that defines our identity or gives us security or status or sense of well-being or whatever. And we're going through that journey individually and we're going through it collectively, isn't it? We're having to reach for a deeper sense of what it is that gives life meaning. And for me, that's part of why the inner aspect of transition is so important, is that when we're putting up, you may never put a graph up, but if we're talking about something like energy descent, like using less resource and creating less pollution, the balance to that story of less that, many people don't want to engage with because they like all the stuff and the variety and the interest it gives them. For me, one of the balancing aspects of the transition story needs to be, this is not what gives us true meaning and true value in our life. And our whole focus on outer and on the material has created, we're at peak distrust of our neighbours, we're at peak alienation, we're at peak drug use. There's lots of things that are peaking that are to do with very negative aspects, and we see that especially when we look at people's inner lives. So I think, that being able to talk about that and ask the question, what is it really that makes us happy as human beings, is a really important piece that goes alongside redesigning our infrastructure, redesigning our systems for living. Is it necessary? My experience is some people are never going to do that. It's absolutely essential for me, and I see that it's essential for others. I see some people that wouldn't have considered it and have found themselves embarking on that journey through the connections and the relationships they've made in transition. And I think there are some people who will never want to have a conversation about their feelings or about, what's going on inside them, and that's absolutely fine. So that's my kind of answer to the inner work question. I don't know much about hospice work. I really appreciate what Carolyn Baker writes, and her books, I think, are really good resources. Navigating the Coming Chaos. I can't remember, Sacred Demise was her first one, but Navigating the Coming Chaos is a more recent one. It has lots of great ideas and processes that people can go through in a group or on their own. I don't know that much about the hospice movement or how you would apply that, so I'd be really interested, to hear, Livy, is it, if you have ideas about that? And this question that I heard from Sharon, how do we make the bridge? How do we open the conversation? And for me, that's a huge question in transition. And I want to tell you that it's a huge question in Totnes, as it is everywhere that I've heard of that transition's happening. So, there were lots of people who could pick up the ideas really quickly in Totnes, or, had been thinking about them already for decades. But there's lots of the population here that are really invested in business as usual, as there is, I think, in most communities around the world, especially in industrialized countries like the UK. So that question is still alive here. How do we invite people into a conversation, or invite people into a discussion or a new way of seeing things? And I think that idea about asking questions is for me one of the most helpful. So it's one of the things I like about talking about stories, is it doesn't say, this is the future, this is my vision, and you have to sign up for it. And one of the ways that I talk about transition is to say, transition says we are going to have to learn to live with less resources. And I love I haven't seen the thing that Obama's been putting out, but that sounds like a really useful tool. If we say, we want to reduce our energy use, we want to reduce our carbon emissions so that the climate stays more stable, so that we're not dealing with these extreme conditions. What's your vision for how we might do that? What's our shared vision? And for me, that's a really powerful question. If we've done a great job of that in 30 years' time, what does our community look like? What's your idea of that? What's our idea together? And I don't know if that's a kind of process that might work. But it feels like it's what we did through open space events in Totnes. So, we would have a talk about issues around, how much of our food how much oil is used to produce our food, 10 calories of oil for 1 calorie of food in the UK. And then we would have a big open space event where we would invite everybody to come and talk about, how does Totnes feed itself after the age of cheap oil? And people just put up their ideas and hosted conversations. So people found the solutions themselves through those very open, flexible conversation kind of events. And I think that's one of the things, that I've been seeing more and more, is that people need that conversation space, not, we need a wake-up call, isn't it? That's what helps us out of the kind of denial. There's nothing that I need to worry about. It's some kind of wake-up call. But then actually people need this space for digestion and connection and working through for themselves what it all means. And I've met people in a lot of transition projects who find it difficult to know how to offer that, and it's often something that inner transition groups bring is kind of conversation cafes or, open space events, world cafes, public events, or spaces for discussion after showing a film, where people really get to talk about the meaning of it and the digestion of it. So I'm really glad that Starhawk's making that film. That's wonderful, and for me, that's one of the very few books that explores what a positive future might actually look like. And I think it's interesting. I'm sure many of you have read it. She sets a kind of permaculture, energy descent, inclusive future in conjunction with a kind of dystopic, very power over kind of business as usual for the rich and collapse for the poor kind of future in her book. And I know there's one or two other books that I've come across where people actually explore this, and I think it is really astonishing how rare they are. Joanne Poirot wrote one called Legacy. She's somebody who started Transition in Los Angeles, which is an inspiring place to do it, if ever there was one. And I've come across Ecotopia, which is an older version of what the west of America looked like when it seeded and went its own way. But there are very few of those books, and it's great if there's actually going to be a film made, where we can see it on screen. So thank you for your comments. We probably have time for a few more if there's anything else. If there's any more kind of deepening conversations.
We usually wrap up at 15 after the hour, so we have time for more. And I'd like to give Julie another try at it.
Yeah.
Julie?
I was trying.
Oh, my gosh. You're there for one word, and then you're gone.
Does that work?
Yes.
No. Really?
Yes. Don't touch anything.
No, I have no idea what to ask. No. I actually don't. So thanks for the offer. It's been a great conversation. I'm happy just to listen.
Okay. And then Janice Lynn?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, it's very interesting because one thing that I heard, Sophie, from you is the whole idea of material consumption. And I have to say that I've read literally 30 years of books on the missing divine feminine and how we hunger because we have to have the wholeness of that divine feminine in our culture, and it's missing. So can you speak to how to bring that missing divine feminine into the storytelling, or how you would get at that material that's already been addressed, even in our lineage of the Grail legends and all that, of the wasteland and the missing feminine? Can you talk to that? And somehow, is there a link in your mind? Because there sure is in mine. And I just don't know. It's kind of an esoteric practice to read those kinds of books, but it seems like they have value, and I just don't know how to bring them forward.
Okay.
And Livy, you might be responding to Sophie?
I just wanted to offer a more thorough explanation of looking at it through the hospice lens if we have time.
Okay. So shall I just, because we've just got a few more minutes?
Yes.
Shall I just respond to Julie and then I don't know how many more hands up there are.
We have one other, but someone who has already spoken. So I think we're good in our time frame.
Okay. Yeah. Because I'd like just a couple of minutes. I think what you're raising, Julie's, sorry, not Julie, Janet, isn't it? About the feminine being missing, I think is really interesting. And the way that I would frame it is around a question about culture. So, one of the things that I talk about quite a lot is this idea of healthy human culture. What's the culture that supports us to be in that state of feeling connected, empowered, resourced, satisfied, nourished, and so on. And I think there are really simple and accessible things that we can bring into our inner world on our own, into our relationships with others, and in transition in particular into our meetings that start to create a culture that puts that kind of feminine quality back into how we do things. And it includes really simple practices like appreciating each other, like taking time at the start of a meeting to hear how we're all doing, like taking time at the end of the meeting to reflect on how the meeting went, taking time in meetings to hear a bit about each other just as human beings. What's going on for you? What do you care about? What are the things that are bothering you? What do you like when you get triggered? How can I help you when that happens? So we're not just focusing on the task, which I think can be one of the things transition groups and other activist groups get very focused on. We're here to do things, and the doing is really important. And I would say it's not about diminishing that in any way, but it's about adding the importance of our relational field. That actually the meetings that I go to where I leave feeling energized and nourished are the ones where I've had some real good human contact there. And that comes from feeling that I've been seen and appreciated and my contributions being valued, but also offering that to other people. And I want to tell you it's something that's a live conversation in Transition Network. How we create meetings that are really connecting and enjoyable. So, it's a short answer to a huge question. How do we rebalance the feminine and the masculine qualities in our whole culture? But that's just a kind of snippet of an answer that I hope is helpful.
Sophie, we do
thank you.
Libby has her hand up, which I didn't see. So can we hear from her? And then if we have time to hear back from Livy, or Livy, you can, if you want to email me, Caroline@transitionus.org. I can send it out to the participants and Sophie about hospice as well. So Libby, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. The thing that I wrestle with most in all of this is time, both for myself and both with other people. The message is always, I don't have time. And I hear myself saying it as well, because not only do the transition projects take time, but addressing all these inner concerns, which is very nurturing. But our culture is, and our means of survival for our jobs, we have to have some money, but not much, is the issue is time.
Thank you.
Yeah, I really agree with you. I think that question of time and our beliefs about time are really powerful and have a powerful effect on how we live. And I don't have any answer to it. I think for me, I live with the same dilemma, isn't it? How to do all the things and have all of that spacious time that I want in my connections with people while getting all the things done that need to be done. And I think it's one of the things that, again, can become a real trap for us in transition if we And it's natural, we're facing this huge change with few of us, and it's urgent, time is pressing. And if we let that belief that there's not enough time run our system, actually we can so easily end up in burnout. We can so easily end up bringing the dynamics of stress and impatience and resentment into our relationships with each other. And for me, it's an ongoing question and practice and inquiry is how can I live with a sense of spaciousness around time while I, feel that I'm making a useful contribution and not kind of letting the future down. And those are big questions. I'll just share with you a great tip that I had from a facilitator, someone who's one of the transition training, who said, never start a meeting or a session saying we're short of time. So, always start saying, we have 5 minutes for this agenda item, and let's trust that this is the exact amount of time that we need, and that everything that really has to happen will happen right now. And that reframing about time, I think, is absolutely brilliant, and I recommend it in your meetings. Never say we're short of time for this, because it immediately sets up a stress response in people's, bodies and their physiology. Always trust, isn't it, that there's enough. And there is something, I think, about that wider aspect of trusting that in transition we're just one small part of a huge movement that is taking the time that it has to take. And we can do what we can to speed that up or to encourage things to happen, but we can't control it, and we're just part of the huge network, the huge global network of that awakening and this change process. And I guess I hope that seeing the 4 stories as part of this, huge collective process, somewhere that eases some of the anxiety in me, to know that this process just is going on and that it is taking its time, but that it is happening and that there are signs that we are moving through these stages and getting to where we need to get to. So thanks for staying for a few extra minutes, and that's my last word.
Can we hear 30 seconds from Livy about hospice?
Yeah, that'd be lovely.
And a final thought from you, Sophie, and we'll wrap it
up.
Livy, go ahead. In as
brief
a time as possible. Thank you.
So exactly what you were saying about time and making the most of time. Hospice, any family who chooses hospice or any person who chooses hospice is in a place of acceptance that it's a terminal condition and that there is limited time, versus an extreme measure in this, and in this growth, like there will always be more. So we can go to the most extreme measures because we want more time. And I think I'll just say that, and that there's many more layers to go much deeper into that. But I'm excited to continue this conversation.
Thank you, Livy. And final comments from you, Sophie, and then I'll open the mics and everyone can give a shout out of thanks to you and maybe let you know where they're calling in from as we sign off for the day. So go ahead.
So thanks, Livy, and it feels good to have something about death maybe at the end of this. It can feel like a kind of morbid subject, but there is something about facing our mortality and facing, the reality of our situation. And for many, people that are caught in the process of addiction, it's not until their state becomes life-threatening and they reach that rock bottom that actually there's enough pressure and enough motivation to make a change. So for me, that's, how we can face the possibility of collapse and be with that as a possible future also can be a strengthening thing. And I think that's another kind of insight that the inner aspect can bring. So thank you for saying that. And maybe that's just a good place to finish, to not be afraid of those dark places, but actually they can be the strengthening and the information that we need to create the motivation for the changes that are coming. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophie. And again, there's a link to Sophie's blog on that same page on our website that lists the event today. and there'll be a recording up there. And Sophy does have a blog ongoing on Transition Network, I believe. Is that correct, Sophy?
It's intermittent, but I'm working on it. Yeah.
Okay. And we hope to repost some on Transition US as well. So